Just after midnight, on a Tuesday in March of 1882, a night watchman named Samuel Crawford carried a lamp and a meal tray down a stone staircase into the basement of the Cumberland County Jail in Portland, Maine. At the far end of a granite corridor that had been used for solitary confinement since 1820, there was a single reinforced iron door with a small barred window at eye level. Crawford expected to slide a tray to an ordinary prisoner. Instead, he dropped it. The figure inside was sitting on the floor with his back to the far wall, and even seated, his head nearly touched the ceiling. His shoulders were wider than the cot they had given him. His hands, resting on his knees, were the size of dinner plates. Crawford wrote later that it was not the size that froze him in place. It was the eyes, pale grey, almost silver, with a depth he compared to looking down a well that had no bottom. The prisoner did not move and did not speak. He only watched, with an expression Crawford could only describe as unbearably sad. 3 weeks after that night, Samuel Crawford was raving about lost empires and stolen history. Within 6 months, every one of the 5 guards assigned to that cell was dead. The prisoner's name was never entered in any record. His crime was never written down. And in 1883, 1 year after he arrived, the cell was bricked over and sealed. If you visit that jail today, the foundation in one basement corner is 3 feet thicker than anywhere else in the building. I'm Julian Crane, an archaeologist the establishment pushed out when I started asking the questions my colleagues wouldn't. So on this channel, I dig up the history they left out. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get into the last guard who watched over a living giant, and the final words he wrote down before it cost him his life. Let me be honest with you before I go a single step further, because it matters. The heart of this story is a journal, and I have never held that journal in my hands. Samuel Crawford was a real man, born in a fishing village outside Portland in 1851. Before the jail, he worked the docks, loaded cargo, and served briefly as a deputy sheriff. Everyone who knew him used the same 3 words: reliable, quiet, unremarkable. He took the night guard position at the Cumberland County Jail in 1880. 2 years later, according to his own account, he became the keeper of something that men in Washington would spend the next 40 years making sure you never heard about. The prisoner arrived on a closed carriage, escorted by 6 armed federal marshals. There was no trial, no arraignment, no paperwork filed with the county clerk. The warden at the time, a man named Tobias Merrick, kept a personal diary, and in it he recorded that the marshals refused to give a name, refused to state the charge, and said only that the prisoner was dangerous and that absolute discretion was required. Merrick put Crawford on the first overnight shift. That is where the journal begins. The journal itself passed to Crawford's sister Emily, who kept it hidden until her death in 1954. Her daughter found the metal box, read the entries, and tried to publish them in 1960. Every publisher turned her down. She tried again in 1972 and got the same answer. The pages now sit in the private collection of a historian in Vermont who will not put his name to it, so I cannot verify a word of it directly, and I am not going to pretend I can. What I can do is lay out what it says and then show you the things around it that are a matter of public record, because that is where this stops being a ghost story. On the second night, Crawford brought a second lamp, hoping that exhaustion and shadow had tricked him. The light only confirmed it. The prisoner's clothing was woven from a material he could not name, thick like canvas but with a faint sheen, stitched in precise geometric patterns he had never seen in any tailor's shop. Crawford asked his name and got nothing. He asked what language he spoke and got nothing. He asked why he was there, and the giant finally stood, and Crawford's lamp flickered as if the pressure in the room had shifted. The prisoner crossed to the bars slowly, the way a man moves when he knows that any speed will be read as a threat. Then he spoke. Crawford described the sound as Latin folded into something far older, rolling consonants and vowels like wind moving through stone, a sound that made his teeth ache. He understood none of it, but the tone, he wrote, was unmistakable. It was not anger, and it was not fear. It was pleading. On the third night, Crawford brought a notebook. If he could not understand the words, he could at least record the sounds. The giant seemed to grasp what he was doing, because he began repeating phrases slowly, pausing between each one like a man teaching a child. By the end of the week, Crawford had filled 20 pages, and he carried them to a linguistics professor at Bodine College named Dr. Howard Fielding, a man who had spent 30 years on ancient and dead languages. Fielding studied the transcriptions for less than 5 minutes, then handed them back. He said the sounds resembled the root structures of Proto-Indo-European, but carried patterns that should not exist in any known language family. He asked where Crawford had heard them. Crawford lied and said immigrant dock workers. Fielding did not believe him, and he said that if the language was real, it predated recorded human civilization by at least 2,000 years. Then he told Crawford to stop asking questions about it. Crawford did not stop. Over the following weeks, through gestures and drawings and endless repetition, he began to understand. The prisoner's name, as near as Crawford could shape it into letters, was Ether. Ether said he was not alone. He said there were others like him, scattered across the continent, hidden in mountains and caves and underground chambers built by hands that were never meant to be forgotten. He said he had been captured in Boston while trying to retrieve something from a building that had been raised on top of one of their old sites. Beneath the bank that stood there in 1882, he told Crawford, there were walls of stone blocks weighing 30 tons each, walls that were already ancient when the first European ships appeared on the horizon. Crawford asked who had built them. According to the journal, Ether's answer was 2 words. We did. Then, on the morning of April the 9th, 26 days after the giant arrived, Crawford came down for his shift and found the cell empty. The door was still locked, the bars were intact. The only thing left behind was a symbol burned into the stone floor, a circle with lines radiating out from the center and smaller circles orbiting it, a mark Crawford had seen in Ether's own drawings. The giant had called it the mark of the first builders. Crawford reported the disappearance to Warden Merrick, and Merrick's response tells you everything. He ordered the cells sealed at once. He told Crawford that no prisoner had ever been held there, that the solitary wing had stood empty for weeks, and that if Crawford breathed a word of it to anyone, he would be charged with filing a false report and dismissed on the spot. Crawford understood a threat when he heard one. He went home, sealed his journal in a metal box, and buried it beneath his own floorboards. He told Emily that if anything happened to him, she was to keep it safe and never hand it to the authorities. 3 days later, Samuel Crawford walked into Portland Harbor and drowned. The official report called it an accident. If Crawford were the only man this happened to, we could file the whole thing under a broken mind and a sad end. But he was one of 5, and this is where the official explanation starts to come apart, because the other 4 break the same way, on the same schedule. Guard number 2 was Patrick Sullivan, an Irish immigrant, 31, married with 2 children, who worked the evening shift. Sullivan kept no journal, but years later his widow told her church group that Patrick had come home one night talking about a man who could bend the bars of his cell and chose not to. He became obsessed with old books on mythology and lost civilizations and haunted the Portland Public Library daily. On the 2nd of May, less than a month after the giant vanished, a load of bricks came loose from a scaffold and crushed him. The ropes were new, the scaffold had been inspected. The entire load simply let go at the exact moment he walked beneath it. In his coat pocket, his widow found sketches of massive stone columns and archways, and she burnt them after the funeral because they frightened her. Guard number 3 was William Hodges, 28, a former Union soldier known for being hard and unsentimental, a man who did not believe in anything he could not see or punch. After the basement assignment, he started drinking heavily and muttering about men who were not men and buildings that did not match the stories we tell ourselves. On the 14th of June, he was found dead in his boarding house. The cause on the certificate was heart failure. He was 28, with no history of illness. His landlord said Hodges had spent the previous night pacing and arguing with someone who was not there, and that he had carved a symbol into the floor beside his bed, a circle with lines radiating outward. The landlord sanded it away before the next tenant arrived. Guard number 4 was Thomas Brennan, 35, an 8-year veteran of the jail who was up for promotion to deputy warden. After the giant arrived, Merrick assigned him to carry meals down twice a day. Brennan's wife later told investigators that her husband turned withdrawn and paranoid, locking the doors and windows at night, giving up church, asking her again and again whether she had ever wondered why certain buildings in town had foundations that ran deeper than they should. On the 30th of July, Thomas Brennan shot himself. His note read only, "They built everything, we built nothing." Guard number 5 was Carl Jensen, just 24, hired only 2 months before the giant came, the least experienced of the rotation. He worked the early morning shift and barely went near the cell. Even that was enough. Jensen quit without explanation in August, moved to Boston, took a job in a factory, and never spoke of the jail to anyone, including his own family. But in 1910, 28 years later, he wrote a letter to the Portland Historical Society, describing a prisoner who was impossibly tall and spoke a language that sounded like rocks grinding together. He wrote that he had suffered nightmares about that man for decades, and that every time he passed a church or a train station or anything with stone foundations, he wondered what might be buried underneath it. Jensen died the following year. His letter sat in a file, unread, until a researcher found it in 2003. 5 men, 5 deaths or breakdowns inside 6 months, all of them healthy and between 28 and 35 before their assignment. You can call one of those a tragedy. You can call 2 a coincidence. 5, on that timeline, is not something chance produces. And whoever arranged it had reach, resources, and a reason. So who was Ether, and why does any of this connect to anything you can actually check? To answer that, we have to talk about a body of evidence that mainstream history has decided to treat as an embarrassment. Through the 1800s, newspapers across the United States ran story after story about giant human skeletons unearthed during construction and excavation. The New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Chicago Tribune, not tabloids, reputable papers reporting bones measuring 7 to 10 feet in length found in burial mounds and caves and dig sites, described by engineers and doctors and local officials who had no reason to invent them. Then, around 1900, the stories stopped. The bones went missing. The Smithsonian Institution, which had been collecting many of these remains, put out statements calling the reports exaggerated or misidentified, and modern archaeology waved the whole phenomenon away as a hoax. And yet the reports still exist, in the hundreds. A researcher named Richard Dunhurst spent years pulling those newspaper accounts together and trying to cross-reference them against Smithsonian records. He found more than 400 documented cases of giant remains discovered in the 19th century. Of those 400, the Smithsonian holds records for fewer than 20, and of that 20, not one of the physical specimens still exists. Dunhurst published his findings in 2013. The Smithsonian issued a statement calling his work a conspiracy theory. What they did not do was open the missing archives. Now set the journal beside that. Crawford wrote that Ether told him his people had tried to coexist with the newcomers, had offered knowledge and shared techniques, and that the newcomers did not want to share, they wanted to own, and ownership required erasing what came before. Ether said agents of the new government had been destroying the evidence since the early 1800s, burning records, sealing ruins, rewriting land surveys to leave out the structures that did not fit. Crawford asked what would happen if the truth ever came out, if people learned that the cities they lived in were built on top of something older and greater. Ether's answer, as recorded, was that they would have to admit they were not the first, and that is something your leaders will never allow. Whether or not you believe a giant said those words, the pattern he described is on the public record. In 1903, workers renovating the Cumberland County Jail broke through a sealed section of the basement and found a cell whose walls were covered in carvings, symbols, star charts, and what looked like architectural diagrams. The university archaeologists they called in looked for 2 hours, pronounced it modern graffiti, and left. One of the workers photographed the walls, and those photographs were published in a regional history journal in 1978. The journal folded 6 months later. In 1955, a construction crew digging a foundation in Boston uncovered a stone chamber 20 feet down, its blocks massive and perfectly fitted with no mortar, its doorway over 10 feet tall and its ceiling 15 feet high, built by every measure for someone much larger than a man. The city filled it in and paved it over inside 48 hours, with no survey and no records. A surveyor on that crew wrote to his brother that the place felt like a tomb he had no business standing in. That letter is now filed in the Boston Public Library under local folklore. And in Philadelphia, a historian in 1972 came across a reference to a circular granite chamber found during the excavation of City Hall in 1871, its walls inscribed with a language no one could read. The city's chief engineer recommended further study. The mayor's office overruled him and had the structure demolished. When the historian went looking for the engineer's original report, it was gone from the archive. She was told the file had been transferred to federal custody in 1920 and never returned. That word, federal, keeps appearing. The marshals who delivered ether wore uniforms with no insignia and named no department. When Merrick pressed them, they said only that they were acting on orders from Washington and that further questions would be treated as obstruction. Merrick's diary surfaced at an estate sale in 1987, and in it he wrote that the marshals threatened him directly, tied the jail's funding to his silence, and implied that his family's safety depended on it. He also recorded something one of them let slip. The prisoner, the marshal said, was not the first of his kind they had handled, that there were facilities in other states holding similar individuals, and that the government had been managing the problem for decades. Merrick asked what the problem was. The man would not answer, except for one line Merrick copied down, word for word. If people knew what was under their feet, they would stop believing in progress, and that would be the end of everything we have built. I have gone back and forth on this story for a long time, and I want to be straight with you about where I land. I cannot prove there was a giant in that basement. The journal is unverified, its chain of custody is thin, and a private collector who will not be named is exactly the sort of thing that should make you cautious rather than convinced. If that were all there was, I would tell you to walk away from it, but it is not all there is. The newspaper reports are real, and you can read them. Dunhurst's count is real, and the Smithsonian's answer to it was to call him names rather than open the drawers. The sealed chambers, the files transferred to federal custody, the reports that were overruled and the sites paved over in 48 hours, those are matters of record, and they do not depend on a single word Samuel Crawford ever wrote. Take the giant out of the story entirely, and you are still left with the same shape. Something old and large keeps turning up under American cities, and something with reach keeps making sure it disappears again before anyone can look too closely. Crawford's journal ends on the 10th of April, the day after ether vanished. He wrote that he no longer knew what to believe, that everything he had been taught about history and progress felt like a lie, and that the prisoner had shown him a world that was older and greater than his own and deliberately forgotten. His final line is a question. If they erased his people, what stops them from erasing us? 3 days later he was dead. I am Julian Crane. I do not know what stood in that cell, and I will not tell you I do. But I know that 5 healthy men do not die on the same schedule for nothing, and I know that the evidence around this story keeps being buried by the same hands, in the same way, over and over. Crawford wrote his last words believing that some knowledge is too dangerous to survive. The strange thing is that his journal survived, the photographs survived, the letters survived, and now the story is sitting with you. So the next time you walk past some great old building and feel the weight of the stone under your feet, ask yourself what it was built on and who decided you were never supposed to know. I'll see you in the next one.